Good afternoon. Oh, sorry. Had an echo, you guys. Hey, good afternoon. My name is Philip Bane. I'm the Managing Director of Smart Cities Council. And good morning to our friends in Australia who are joining us. Adam Beck, our Executive Director of Smart Cities Council, Australia, New Zealand, and Lucinda Hartley, a co-founder at Neighbourlytics. So as you can see, we're trying to span the globe. You'll see that we have several people on. I'll just introduce them briefly and others will join us. This is very much intended to be a conversation about using data to improve community resilience. Jeff Benavides is the Chief Sustainability and Resilience Officer from Orange County. Jeff, raise your hand just so everybody sees you. Faye DiMassimo is a Senior Advisor to Mayor John Cooper in Nashville. We have Dr. Christine Boyle from Xylem. We have Dr. Mariela Alfonso from State of Place. I'm seeing Roger Lindsay, who is a Senior Floodplain Manager in Nashville. I'm seeing Tom Palco, who is the Associate Director of the Public Works Water Department for Nashville. The folks from Nashville have been working with us now for about 6 months, and Orange County started about a month ago. And I see Dr. Janey just joined us from Vanderbilt. So with that, you will see that there are a number of presentations that you can download. One I want to point out in particular is from Fairfax County, which is where I live in Northern Virginia. And I'm on a citizen panel that's reviewing the work of the Environmental Department of Fairfax County. And the reason, this is a public document they released about a week ago when they launched. And the two reasons I was sharing this with everybody is, one, to highlight that it's not just Nashville and Orange County that's interested in resilience, it is the whole world. There are many cities that are trying to figure out how do you make your communities resilient. The other thing I'll point out about Fairfax is they're spending a lot of money, they're well-intentioned, they have great people, and they're taking a slightly different approach, a more sort of waterfall, traditional approach using historical data. We're actually talking about a very different approach today, and I'm really excited about that. So now we're going to kick it off with Faye, who's a good friend, senior advisor in the last year. Not only has she been helping us and leading this Nashville flooding project to mitigate the impact of urban flooding, but they just launched a 1.5 billion transportation program. And Faye, why don't you give us an overview? And I'm particularly interested in your equity and design piece, because for me, that's what really launched all this.
Sure. Well, we've been so excited. Thank you for the opportunity to join today, and we've been so excited to be a part of the Smart Cities Council work. I know you're going to hear from my colleagues, the experts, on the vulnerabilities of our population around urban flooding, which we know is a common disaster in the United States. We believe that the work that we're doing there is going to be not only instructive and important for us in Nashville, but in the way that it can be both scaled and replicated by our peer cities around the world. But we've had quite the year in Nashville. And I think it's always a good story to tell and a good story to start off with when we're talking about resiliency. I don't know that anyone can be more resilient than Nashville or has had more opportunities to demonstrate it. So I've been working for Mayor John Cooper, a brand new mayor in Nashville, for about a year and a half. And he came in the door to an issue that he knew existed, but perhaps we all didn't know the depth of it in terms of some financial, structural stabilities that needed to be addressed for Metro Nashville, and started off with that sort of known matter. But then we immediately went into issues around a tornado that struck our city, followed by derecho winds, followed by civil unrest, followed by a bomb, followed by flooding. You couldn't tell a more resilient story than Metro Nashville's. And
you didn't even mention COVID, Faye.
The pandemic. I'm sorry. The pandemic was sort of the umbrella over all of that. And in a town like ours, that is a place that is very much tourism based, as you can imagine, the economic impact here was felt even more deeply than in perhaps some other communities. Meanwhile, while all of that mayhem was going on around us, we also were accomplishing great things, and we were participating in the Smart Cities Council Challenge, and we were developing Metro Nashville's first transportation plan. As Philip mentioned, a $1.6 billion plan, and core and center to that was a tool that we developed called Equity by Design. We know that when we talk about resiliency, there's no more core element of that than equity. Equity is top of mind for certainly every city in America, and I suspect many cities around the world right now. And so what we decided was, rather than take a policy-driven approach to equity, sort of looking at it from the big picture, the top, and moving down, we said we've already got that. Equity is certainly a policy goal, and we've been more detailed in that. But what we really want to do is see how can we build it from the ground up. And that means that every single project that we engage on should have an equity contribution that it makes back to the overall system, to the overall community of the city. So we developed an Equity by Design framework that has it's a living tool, so it can have things certainly added to it, but it's got about 18 different pieces of connectivity, of equity connectivity, that we want to look at every project and see how is that project making that contribution. And if we're thoughtful and deliberate about that in the design of every project, then the projects themselves necessarily will contribute to the system of equity that we want to achieve. So while it has been a remarkable year, both on the challenges and the accomplishment side, we're very proud that, you know, what we've seen is our courage has borne out those kinds of tools that has made us think more deeply and more thoughtfully about what is really resiliency in a community and how does equity need to be really the very heartbeat of it.
Thank you, Faye. So next I want to introduce Jeff Benavides, Chief Sustainability and Resilience Officer for Orange County. Orange County was our second winner this year, along with Brisbane, which was the third of the Readiness Challenge. And I really want to say a lot about Jeff. I've really been impressed. He was prescient about applying to the challenge, because now we're actually working with Orange County to accelerate some of their projects now that they have this additional funding. And it's really been an interesting journey, and we have a lot more work to do. One of the things I really look forward to with both Nashville and Orange County is the ability to visit both locations, Orlando and Nashville, later in the year when we do our scoping workshops. So Jeff, why don't you give us an overview of some of the work we're doing, but also how resiliency fits in?
Thank you, Philip. I'm glad Faye started the session, because I'm super jealous and envious, and I'm hopeful that we can share the tools that we're talking about today with one another. And it's part of this, beauty of the Smart Cities Council collaboration, of course, that we've entered in. The Smart Cities Council has graciously awarded Orange County and the greater Orlando region in Florida a technical assistance grant, and through this initiative, we're really focusing around smart and healthy buildings. So of course, there's a lot of Internet of Things and smart infrastructure and resilient infrastructure from a digital buildings and risk overall. But today I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the items that Faye was talking about, specifically when it comes to community resilience. And just like Faye mentioned, Orlando, as arguably the #1 tourist destination in America with 75 million visitors that we had in 2019, we were hit rather hard. And through this time, we've really defined what community resilience means to us here in Orange County. And unfortunately, a lot of our hardest hit communities has been very difficult to work through, but we have been strong and safe as much as we can. And with the leadership of our public officials, as well as Mayor Demings, who has been here for about 40 years in the community as a public servant in public safety. So it's very interesting how timing ended up happening here in Orange County. Just quickly, from a definition standpoint, that was one thing that we've been able to do over the last year since I started right before the pandemic. We've really defined that community resilience is the capacity of individuals, as well as industries, and of course our local government operations within a community to absorb and endure and recover from those impacts of any type of shock or stressor that comes to us. And we've really tried to be creative on creating a regional resilience collaborative. You may have seen some of these collaboratives throughout the country, and we're no different here. But through our regional council that oversees 8 different counties throughout our region, we've created this one mission of people, places, and prosperity, which is really those focus of those resilience pillars. So through that, we have been thinking about, well, how do we measure resilience, and how do we try to, at a regional scale, what are these socioeconomic indicators, natural indicators, disaster indicators, whatever it is. So we did a really deep dive last year and spent the time. This project was actually ongoing before the pandemic, but ended up being incredibly helpful for us as we worked through the pandemic. And we looked at a variety of different tools and benchmarking platforms, and we ended up arriving at the FEMA CREA tool. And for those of you that are in tune with some of the FEMA tools that are out there, this is the Community Resilience Indicator Analysis. And we felt that this series of 20 indicators, socioeconomic indicators mostly, really felt to measure what community resilience meant to our community and the ability for us to bounce back. So what we've done is a full spatial analysis across each of the counties, measuring things that you get from our census data and our socioeconomic data, like unemployment rate, disability, English language proficiency, home ownership, public school capacity, medical professional capacity, all of these different metrics over time that we've analyzed over 10 years and assigned ourselves, as well as our 8 counties in the region, with 5 other counties in the state, this score, this resilience score. And we're looking to enhance this score. And now I'm so glad that we're able to collaborate with some others here as far as the Sustainable Development Goals dashboard that we want to build, along with our Lead for Cities and Communities index, with our quality of life indexes that we have. So again, all these dashboards and all these different ways to measure true resilience from a, how do we get a pulse on the community with data, and trying to get, ahead of that and forecast and predict some of these changes and testing that resilience over time. So hopefully that's a little bit helpful. We're about to dive into another engagement here with the Environmental Protection Agency. We were just awarded a Building Blocks grant to go for and do a disaster resilience plan for all of our municipalities here in Orlando area and Orange County, which is about 13 different smaller cities and towns, with Orlando being the largest, representing about 1.4 million people total. So with that, I'll end my comments there, and really excited to keep collaborating with some of the folks here.
Thank you, Jeff. And when we send out an email afterwards, we'll link to a page that has the, what was the name of it again? Sustainability and Resilience Action Plan from 2020. And this was a really interesting, I mean, I've read it. I hate to say it's almost like 65 pages, but it has metrics and everything else. And it's really interesting because citizens helped put it together. So with that, I'm going to introduce Dr. Christine Boyle, who is with Xylem, a census most of you know in the United States. And Xylem's been around for a long time. They're a multi-billion-dollar water company. They're doing business right now with Nashville. They've done business throughout Florida. But what was really interesting was when Christine introduced to us about a month ago this concept of water equity. And I was just really impressed about how a big company that mostly dealt with infrastructure and IoT would find a way to introduce equity into their work. So with that, Christine, go ahead. And I know everybody, this link that she's showing, this website, is in the chat, so you can easily link to it and look at it yourself. But go ahead, Christine.
Thanks, Phil, and thank you for having me. It's a great honor to be part of this conversation, and Faye and Jeff, to hear a little bit about what you all are doing in your cities. As Phil mentioned, my focus and the focus of my career and Xylem as a company is around water. So, talking about your entire built environment as city managers and city officials, we're going to spend 10 minutes here kind of slicing off a piece of that, which is water and water services. Similar to the national conversations on equity in general, water equity has really emerged in the last 2 years as more and more of a guiding principle around how we invest in programs, in infrastructure, in jobs and training, all these aspects. So Xylem is as Phil mentioned, is a global company, historically major provider of pumps, metering, water treatment technologies, things of that nature. So when we say our kind of motto is let's solve water, and we really take that to heart as far as our sustainability goals, and water equity is a piece of that. You can't solve water for one group and not the other. And so this is where we're really embracing equity as a way to demonstrate and measure equitable outcomes and progress, and highlight when we need to that there isn't a win for water unless there's a win for all people in communities. So I have just published a blog, and I thought that would be a neat way for us to kind of take a few minutes and take a look at what we're doing on water equity. I believe it's in your chat bar, so if people can, please feel free to click on that, and you can scroll around while I kind of talk through a few points here. So important for me to highlight is that there is a incredibly important group in the United States of America called the U.S. Water Alliance that has really been at the edge of defining water equity in the United States. And I'm excited to announce for those on the call that don't know is that the CEO of the U.S. Water Alliance, a woman named Radhika Fox, I believe yesterday was approved as the nomination by the Biden administration to lead the EPA Office of Water. So the U.S. Water Alliance has put forth a definition of water equity where it has three main pillars around access to water, which you think of everything from can all people afford to purchase the water, to are all schools and homes have access to safe drinking water coming out of their tap. And we all know that Flint, Michigan was a major example of a failure in that area. And but just kind of to illustrate what access means. We also have a second pillar, which if you kind of scroll through the tool here, you'll see is around benefits. Benefits is where we think about the community involvement in water infrastructure management and investment. Are you employing people within your community to work for the water utility? Are communities involved in small business opportunities as well as planning and decision making? And the third pillar is resilience. Resilience is focused on, well, to Faye's point around Nashville, one of the many points she made, like things like flooding. Are you resilient to climate change and floods? Do all communities have equal resilience in the face of drought, flood, leaks, things of that nature? So what we've done at Xylem is taken an analytical approach. And Jeff, when you were talking about the FEMA calculator, I was like, this is very familiar. What we decided was water utilities and cities talked a lot about water equity, but didn't really have a great way to measure it and to have visibility across their neighborhoods of how communities were involved in doing along these pillars of water equity. So we have a digital solutions group at Xylem, which I'm a part of, and we thought we can get access to data, and we can create a transparent, empirically driven tool so utilities can measure how they're doing along water equity. So I hope everyone's kind of scrolling through the tool, but you can see on a map that we have picked out many indicators for each of the three pillars, such as the household burden indicator. This is demonstrating for the lowest 20th percentile of income households, how much of their annual household income is going towards their water and wastewater bill. And where that percentage is very high, you have yourself a problem that people will be getting their water shut off, failing to pay their water bills, going without water due to shutoffs. So that again would kind of show you where you might want to place your programmatic dollars. So we do this in this map for access, for benefits, and for resilience. And so we're excited to be bringing this tool to water utilities in the United States of America. We're beginning a program this summer to work with 6 or 7 water utilities and build this out for specific water utilities. What you see in the map is a sample, a kind of an illustrative data that we use for Naperville, Illinois, but we applied some kind of illustrative demographic profiles on top of Naperville to kind of show our points here. And so that's kind of my excitement about this. I think we want to empower utilities, empower communities to drive equitable outcomes around water services. And the infrastructure bill and the infrastructure week, all the activities going on in DC right now are, exciting moment for water. And Radhika Fox has been talking about this. This is the moment for water. We need it more than ever to fortify our communities against drought, against floods, against climate change impacts. So I'm thrilled to be part of such an esteemed group of kind of technologists. So I will kind of end my comments there and encourage people to click through and contact me if you have questions, but I'll kind of pass to my next colleague to speak about her technology and how she's thinking about equity in communities.
Thank you, Christine. And just as a reminder to everybody, there are billions of dollars in the American Rescue Act, and there are more funds coming available for water infrastructure, which is frankly the oldest type of infrastructure we have in the country. And generally, for every $1 billion we spend on water infrastructure, we create about 1 million jobs. So it's really, no, I'm sorry, it was 40,000 jobs. I got my numbers mixed up. But it was it's a valuable investment for all of us. So next I'm going to introduce somebody. Why don't you guys mute for a second? Dr. Mariela Alfonso, who is the founder of State of Place. And I'm really excited. Christine, Dr. Boyle introduced the concept of equity as part of infrastructure. And Mariela is going to introduce the concept of equity as part of spatial analysis and data. So is your screen set up, Mariela?
I tried to accept, but it said that I had to quit GoToMeeting.
Oh, you got, okay, yeah, okay. So this is what we will do. I have your slides and I can take it, and then you can just tell me to flip the slides.
Okay.
I knew I would be useful for something. Okay.
Oh, technology, when presenting about a technology company.
Yeah, it's just give me a moment here. I gotta get the. It was the shorter deck, right? I think you had 2 decks, right?
It was the one with no, it was the second one I sent. It has 42 slides, I think.
Okay. Just give me a second here. Okay, I got it. Sorry about that.
Is there possible to show my screen? Is that another way to do it?
Well, that's what we were. No, you have to.
That's what we did.
And that's what you're going to have to
Oh,
go back. Yeah.
that I can do. I thought you were like taking over. I was taking over the screen. Can you see my screen or no?
Not yet, but you need.
Oh, no.
Go ahead and share the screen with you, and then you need to. There you go. You got it. Okay. You're good. Thank
So
you, Dr. Alfonso, the technologist. Go ahead.
Great. Everyone, thanks for bearing with me on that. Okay, so I'm going to start just kind of telling you a personal story because for me, places, people, resiliency, equity is quite personal. Let's see. So one of the most vivid memories I have as a kid growing up in Miami, not this Miami, but this one, is scrounging through my mother's beat up old Pontiac 6000 LE, looking for change in between the seat cushions because it was the end of the month and things were tight till next payday. And we were hoping to find enough money to get a soup at Dunkin' Donuts. As a first-generation immigrant daughter of a single mom struggling to get by on a secretary's salary, raising me and my brother with special needs, I have a lot of stories like this. Indeed, many of my most painful childhood memories are tied to cars, from the driver who killed my 15-year-old friend while she was crossing a 6-lane highway, masquerading as a city street, exactly like the one that I crossed near daily, to the cry-inducing calls I used to get from my mechanic while I was at my work-study job at college with news that it was going to cost at least 2 of my upcoming paychecks to fix my car. But what perhaps left the most indelible imprint on me was the most mundane of these, my daily drive to school. So since I lived in an underfunded and underperforming school district, as like in many places in the US, school budgets are tied to hyper-local property taxes, my mom, with her education is key immigrant ethic, sacrificed what little we had to put me in private school, which also happened to be in the opposite direction of where she worked, further fueling the already high price tag of this kind of Sophie's choice. It seems like so much of my and my family's struggles were exacerbated by issues related to the tie between land use planning, transportation, and the built environment. And my life is tantamount to the exponential power of place to shape our lives across all aspects of quality of life. But it turns out that my Miami story isn't that unique. Nearly every single one of us has been shaped by urban design, the places you go, how you get there, and what they feel like at street level. So look at this street, for example, or these 2 streets rather. Like, how do they make you feel? Which one do you actually prefer? Well, their design influences more than just how we feel, and also what we do and how safe we are, right? Which then translates to the kinds of stats and metrics you all are talking about measuring that matter to, of course, cities, and are part of your goals, like reducing collisions or getting a child to walk to school, or, you know, and another example, of course, it influences our travel, which then impacts all of the sustainability aspects that we're talking about, but also your residents' health and the costs of caring for them. So it's all really interconnected, this relationship between place and people and quality of life. You can't really look at one without understanding the other. Or to put it another way, since we're talking about infrastructure, or what I'm going to be focusing on today, community scale infrastructure influences our behaviors and various outcomes, which then influence the key performance metrics and the return on investment metrics that you all are measuring. And ultimately, it's really important to remember that infrastructure is personal. And this is why I've dedicated 20 plus years at this point of my life quantifying this relationship between place, people, and quality of life and all of these different metrics, mostly so that we can actually create a data-driven justification for why place matters and more seamlessly advocate for better places. And this is because cities tend to have kind of 2 very interconnected issues with making, getting the buy-in for things like community scale infrastructure investments. First, like, gosh, how do we make these decisions, which is what you guys are getting at today, especially given so many different priorities and limited budgets. And then how do we communicate about these decisions in a way that engages the community, that builds trust, and that ultimately gets us to the consensus that we need to get these projects funded and approved, right? So this is really where state of place comes in. So the approach that we've taken is we collect data on over 150 aspects of what we call micro scale urban design features. So these are things like trees, benches, sidewalks, curb cuts, the number of vehicle lanes, the setbacks, the colors of buildings, all of these things that, again, sort of influence how we feel in a place, whether you know it or not. We've quantified that. And we are now collecting that using visual machine learning. So we can take digital imagery like Google Street View, and then we have these machine learning models that have learned like, oh, this glob over here is a building, or this over here is a tree, so that we can automatically extract this data and provide spatial data like this at a very, very fine-grained scale citywide. So then we crunch this data into a score that we call the State of Place Index, and we're all trying to quantify stuff. So this is our contribution to the measurement aspect, but we're measuring the built environment piece. And this basically just measures how walkable, livable, or bikeable a community is. And this is sort of the thing that influences all of these other outcomes that we're trying to improve in our cities. So we also break this down into 10 areas of what we call urban design dimensions. This is because we really want the index to be something not just that you're measuring and saying how we're doing or how, what we need to improve, but really being able to diagnose what's working and what's not. Why did we get this actual score, and what could we do to make it better? So we have our software allows you to access this information graphically, so you can literally look at this diagnostic across these 10 aspects of urban design block by block, or whatever geographical area you're looking at. So maybe you're looking at how does a vulnerable area compared to a privileged area, for example. And of course, you can look at it spatially in heat maps. The other aspect of the tool that goes back to what I was saying before about this connection between place, people, and outcomes is we actually have forecasting models that show how changing state of place or increasing your state of place index influences a whole bunch of different outcomes, from real estate metrics to various economic development metrics to health metrics that we'll go over in a second. And so
predictive, Mariela, that's a predictive type?
That is our predictive aspect of the tool, exactly. So what this allows us to do is to say, oh, actually some urban design changes matter more than others, depending on what goal you're trying to optimize. Do you want to mitigate floods? Do you want to reduce diabetes? Do you want to mitigate the number of vehicle collisions? So this allows you to kind of begin to set early level priorities of what to invest in the community scale infrastructure side that's going to actually most likely have the kinds of outcomes that you want to achieve for your community. And we have a scenario tool that you can use directly with your communities themselves. It's a little bit like SimCity, so you can kind of make changes to the built environment, add some trees, add some sidewalks, and then in real time be able to see what your new state of place index score would be if you were to make these changes. So like this is just one example of the 2 street dimensions that I showed you earlier. And this is the forecasting tool that takes it to the next level to say, okay, so I have a certain number of points increase in state of place. What does that mean? Why should I care about that? And so we're able to predict specifically, in this case for like retail rents, what would be the potential increase, which of course would then influence tax revenues for the city. So this is just some examples of just kind of like really visualizing what this means. So on the left, you have, near zero retail activity versus on the right, you're going to see a huge increase just because of this increase in better urban design. And here's, from a safety perspective, really being able to reduce the number of vehicle collisions. And this is all things that we predict. Specifically, we can tell you if you make these changes, this is what's likely going to happen. So the reason that I think Philip asked me to speak today is the work that we're doing with Philly. So all of this work was stuff that we had been doing sort of pre-COVID. And then COVID hit, and we had already been trying to expand our forecasting models to look at all sorts of aspects of quality of life and value. But COVID made that much more obvious that needed to happen yesterday, especially since what we're noticing is that the same vulnerable communities that had been historically burdened were the ones that were suffering the most from COVID. And we saw this across, different aspects from a resiliency perspective, from a health perspective, all tied back to these issues of equity and vulnerability. And so we knew that that it was very likely that the disinvestments to that urban design of these communities were contributing to these outcomes. So we wanted to be able to quantify that. So we collected data, in this case, for 17 zip codes that kind of varied across vulnerability. And then we mapped them with state of place, so you can start to see kind of, oh, these are areas that are doing better versus worse from an urban design perspective. And then we started to just compare them with respect to certain outcomes like COVID. So we saw patterns of, where there was higher state of place, there were lower COVID positivity rates, for example. We saw similar patterns with respect to the floodplain. So areas in the floodplain that tended to have lower scores on the state of place index. And similar to heat, although heat is a little bit tricky, so we kind of delved into that because it looked like higher places with higher state of place had higher heat. But once you delve deeper into the data, it was really that what you needed to focus on was parks and public spaces. So you could have had a high state of place index, but if you didn't have a high score within the parks and public spaces, you weren't going to be mitigating the heat. So these are all patterns that we were able to see with this spatial data, but then we translated it back to these again, predictive analytics. So like, okay, well, what does it mean? Like, how can we actually shape these places? So in this case, for example, an increase of 5 points in state of place is tied to 1 less death from COVID. Similarly, 10 points increase, 5 fewer people hospitalized, 20-point increase, a reduction in 0.5% of positivity, which starts to make a big difference, right? We saw this. We also looked at kind of like, well, what does this look like for below average state of place, which again, most vulnerable communities had, versus above average state of place. And as you can see, huge differences in positivity rate, hospitalization rates, and ultimately fatality rates. Similar interesting findings from the flood perspective. So what we found was that if you were in the floodplain, you also had almost a 20% decrease in your state of place index, which means that these places are not only vulnerable from a flood perspective, they're lacking all of these urban design features that could mitigate those floods, but also have all of these other benefits that we need to think about. And then from the heat perspective, again, an increase in 10 points for parks and public spaces, was related to a negative 0.5 drop in the heat difference in that particular block group. So ultimately, what we found were the things that we kind of thought were already happening. Higher state of place meant lower COVID rates. We also saw that that was tied to lower rates of COVID comorbidities, lower rates of flood, and then also lower heat differences. But on the flip side, from an equity perspective, we saw the opposite story. So the places where the most vulnerable had the least access to better places with a higher state of place index. So a higher state of place index meant you had lower concentrations of Black residents, you had higher income, you had higher people working from home, lower education rates, household sizes that were higher, and then lower access to vehicles. So this really kind of just highlights how important it is to look at all of these things together at the same time. Ultimately, we didn't just leave the city there. We're giving them specific recommendations. Again, going back to this, okay, what are the leverage points? What are the things that are going to really make a difference that the city can prioritize given limited budgets? So we're giving them specific recommendations of what to do, and then integrating all of this into a new version of the software that we're releasing later this summer that allows you to actually predict everything that I just showed you here and more. So ultimately, really, this is about a story around microscale data and predictive forecasting that really helps you begin to prioritize funds in a way that's actually going to lead to the outcomes that you want, but also in the meantime, build community engagement and trust, because you can use the tool with the community, but also it has this transparency of like, why you're making the decisions and you can explain that. So ultimately leading to more resilient, happy people and places. So that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mariela. This is, we'll save, I have one question for you, but we'll save questions until Lucinda's finished. So much of this applies to our work with Nashville, so I'll really be interested in seeing what the Nashville team thinks. But Dr. Camp, Janey Camp, did have a question. She says, what's the temporal aspect of your index? Is it a one-time analysis and then you recalculate 6 months or a year later to evaluate the change over time? And she'll come back in when we have the general questions, but she's our partner in the work in Nashville from Vanderbilt.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It really depends on what the city wants. The kinds of features that we collect data for, which is really different than what Lucinda does, which she'll explain, doesn't change that much. Unfortunately, the pace of change in the built environment isn't very high. So even if you update this on a yearly basis, it would do. But we also timestamp the images from which we collect data. So if you know that there's a project that happens, we can easily go back in and collect data very specifically for blocks that we know have changed, so that to make sure that the data is up to date.
Great. Good morning, Lucinda. How are you?
Good morning. I'm good, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, very appreciative of you. I know you wake up early anyway.
I've been up for hours.
Yeah, so anyway, thank you for doing this. Do you have the screen? Can you take the screen?
I've had to reload this on a different computer, so I'm just, oh yeah, hang on, is it giving me the permissions now? Yes, I think, I just don't see where to share on my.
You should see a dialog box that says that you're
I don't see that, but maybe Philip, if you're able to share my slides, that just for time's sake, that might be.
It was the PDF, right, Lucinda?
Yeah, the PDF.
Okay, let me pull it up and then I'll take the screen.
I can request keyboard and mouse control. No, I don't know if that's.
Okay, so I'll change presenter. Don't worry, I'm taking it back, so.
All right, no worries.
Okay, so there we go, Lucinda, I have it.
Thank you very much. And thank you so much also to the other panelists. It's a real pleasure to learn what's happening in Orange County and Nashville, and always fantastic to see your work, Mariela, as well. Neighbourlytics is a digital analytics platform that looks at measuring and quantifying the urban life of neighbourhoods, and in a very complementary way to Mariela and State of Place. In fact, we've worked on some collaborative projects together, which has been really interesting. So if you just go to the next slide, Philip, I think One of the things that's been both heartbreaking and fascinating from an urban development perspective over the past 12 months is the pace of change of cities. I think we often think of cities being very static, long-term planning places, but the last 12 months has shown us how quickly things can change. And this is a local open air market that's actually just a few minutes from my house here in Melbourne. And I think from a data perspective, what's interesting is that the physical environment of this place in the last 12 months actually didn't change, but its urban life did dramatically. If you go to the next slide. Urban life for Neighbourlytics, which is the core aspect of what we measure, refers to the everyday activity that goes on within and between buildings. It's the intangible software of the city, its social and cultural life, its economic and community activity, and looks at how places are used and occupied and experienced and valued. And urban life data, which is the sort of core of the Neighbourlytics platform, is then what we use to understand resilience and social prosperity and well-being and other factors. If you go to the next slide. Just to put this in context briefly, urban life we talk about as the filling in the sandwich that sits between other city data sets that you're probably using and have good access to, such as the physical environment. How do we understand the zoning and land use information of a place? But we also know that the zoning of a place may not necessarily be a good predictor of its actual use. We might find that it's used by startups and community organisations or a particular type of cafe and small business rather than the other industries that it might be planned for. Similarly, sentiment and community engagement data, whilst is critical to understand in terms of understanding a community's aspirations and vision for the future, this kind of data, particularly when it's survey-based, can be have not necessarily be representative and is difficult to gather any kind of time series. One of the other challenges about engagement data is what we think and what we think we want is often different from what we actually do in reality. And so Neighbourlytics focuses on behavioural and lifestyle data to give us a picture of what we do, not what we think we do. And I often use the example, if you ask me in a survey how often I go to the gym, I'm probably going to tell you what I want you to think about me rather than what I actually do in reality. You go to the next slide. So we know that urban life is really critical for the way that we understand the resilience and well-being of our cities. There's so much research about, and I think, Jeff, you really pointed to some of the social economic research you've been doing about looking at demographics and understanding community resilience from a social perspective. We know that social life is critical to that, but we often don't have a mechanism for really measuring that very well. But we do have that same mechanism sometimes for physical information. If you go to the next slide. So how can we look at this? And Neighbourlytics taps into the everyday digital footprints that we leave behind about what we value and what we interact with in our built environment in order to measure urban life. So that's check-ins, likes, business and community pages, map-based information that you might find from something like Google Maps. And we tend to think of Google Maps as, you know, perhaps a source of truth for a city, but it's actually a crowdsourced map. The map points that are on there are because people put them there or because there's a point of interest that the internet recognizes as a point of importance. And so we have this behavioral layer that we can understand from looking at online activity about a place. Neighbourlytics brings multiple different sources into one single proprietary data set that we're then able to use for further analytics. I lost your screen for a moment there, Philip.
Oh, sorry, I lost you. Go ahead. Sorry. Where are we?
Okay, can you still see me?
Yep, now we can see you.
I can't see the slides. Can others see the slides?
Okay, let me put it back. There we go.
Perfect, thank you. Next slide, thanks. So one of the interesting things about digital data like this is it can operate across multiple scales. So it can go right down to a 1 kilometre radius or a 20 or 15-minute neighbourhood, the things that you have in that immediate catchment area. But then you can also use it to compare any neighbourhood in the world on that same dimension, and you can aggregate it up to a municipal or even state level, comparing the same metrics across those different dimensions. Next slide. We've been working around the world with a bunch of different customers across the private and public sector to get a shared understanding of how urban life and resilience data can work in play. And I'm going to share just 2 examples now, if you go to the next slide. One is how this has been applied for community development. And next slide again. This is a slide of one of the other times I was wearing a mask this year, not for COVID. Australia, like many parts of the US, is very bushfire prone, and my family live up in a rural area of Australia. This was in January 2020, where we had the largest fires that we had ever had on record. That hill behind, which is 8 kilometers away, is on fire at the time this photo was taken, and we were subsequently evacuated that afternoon. We were lucky in having good preparedness. Many of the town, if you go to the next page, looked like this in subsequent days and weeks. Now, the recovery and decimation from forest fires, in many ways similar to what we've seen in California this year, is a question of resilience. Some places can recover from this kind of devastation better than others can. If you go to the next slide. Fires are not new to Australia, and this is actually a slide from a project 10 years ago. There were another major bushfire in a place called King Lake, and the strategy at the time to rebuild was to support a whole range of community infrastructure. Now, it seems like a good idea. King Lake used to have an outdoor basketball court, and it was replaced with this fancy new indoor basketball court. Now, that seemed like a good, appropriate use of bushfire funding, but actually in reality, what was found was this town, which is fairly under-resourced in lots of ways, didn't have the capacity to use this space. They mostly don't use it because they can't afford the electricity to keep the lights on. They also can't afford the floor buffering, so people have to play there in bare feet, where previously the outdoor asphalt court did just fine in supporting needs. Now, to avoid this kind of, I guess, misallocation of recovery funds for the bushfire, Neighbourlytics was involved in community analysis of a range of affected towns. If you go to the next slide. What we were able to measure here was what the local neighbourhood strengths were. We were able to look through the lens of business and community assets and strengths to understand what was working well. And one thing that we know from the social research on resilience is that a strengths-based approach, looking at what places are good at and leveraging that, is usually going to be more effective than honing in on what they don't have. What we found in this one particular town is that its destinations, particularly its cafes and its retail, were strongest, and its community clubs were actually not as present. And so what we were able to do is convince support for local business recovery rather than community facilities in this particular instance as a more effective strategy of mitigating recovery. That was a counter strategy than what had previously done, as it wasn't considered possible to give money for business support. Next page. At a really different end of the spectrum, we've been looking on how we can understand urban life to leverage innovation districts. Around the world, there's an increasing focus on using investment in urban development to catalyze job attraction, particularly talent attraction and growth around innovation districts. Next slide. Brooklyn's Navy Yard is one example of that, and many others around the world. Understanding what makes some of these precincts successful and others just regular urban development precincts is to do with its urban life. It's to do with the activity and what Brookings Institute calls its networking capital that goes on within and between buildings. But it's often invisible and hard to quantify. So if you go to the next slide, Neighbourlytics looked at 10 precincts around the world that have been proven to increase job growth as a result of urban development, and looked at what some of their metrics were around urban life so that we could learn from that for future development proposals. If you go to the next slide. That included two of the interesting things that we found is that 60 to 70% of all of the place activity that was recorded actually wasn't to do with the businesses or jobs itself. It was to do with cafes. It was to do with bar and dining, hospitality and retail. And so these places that had successfully increased their job growth were doing so because they'd increased their livability and their activity more so than they'd actually created the jobs. So there was an interesting correlation there. If you go to the next slide, I've got 2 more slides, and we've got an interesting discussion ahead. We've been monitoring a number of cities during COVID and looking at both on a micro scale and also on a city scale around how behaviour and lifestyle changes have impacted the ways different cities have made decisions. At the moment, quite a lot of our work is focused, if we go to the next slide, on measuring the impact of temporary interventions that have been installed as a result of COVID. Tactical urbanism is an incredibly useful strategy for transfer, encouraging us to live outside at a time when we need to physical distance. And many cities are asking the question of whether these kinds of projects should be retained. And we have a lot of anecdotal evidence from individual businesses that they've been successful or haven't been successful, but data can really help build the business case of why they should, or in some cases perhaps shouldn't, be made permanent. So in this particular example, in the city of Yarra in inner Melbourne, we saw an increase in business activity and public space activity as a result of these street closures, which helped the city build their business case for permanency. So I'll leave it there. But one of the things that the headline story, I think, for 2020 is one of resilience, of seeing local businesses pivot overnight and become takeaway stores and delivery agencies. And that gives me enormous hope that our cities have enormous capacity to withstand change, and being able to understand that urban life activity is one mechanism for charting the pathway forward.
Thank you very much, Lucinda. And if Faye and Jeff and some of the others could join us, I know Tom and Roger and Janey, Dr. Camp, would really appreciate it. Give everybody a second here. So just I could ask a ton of questions, but I'm going to defer to Janey and Roger, who've just joined us. There's Tom. These people, along with Faye and Jeff, actually do the work every day to make us safe. So I'd love it. What are the questions that we can start with? Janey, I started with one question you had, but I think you had another also.
I guess it was more of an observation than a question, thinking about how you could apply some of these approaches to justify or look at the benefits associated with capital investments in some areas of a city to help make the case for buy-in and investment from community members. And I guess since we're focused here in Nashville, as part of the Smart Cities Council initiative on urban flooding, I wonder to what extent we could apply some of these mechanisms to kind of quantify the benefits of putting in, green infrastructure and more green space that could potentially benefit, have mutually beneficial outcomes both for the citizens and the city by reducing flooding, but also creating, a better state of place in some areas of the community, especially those where we have low-income citizens and vulnerable populations. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, Dr. Alfonso, I mean, she actually covered some of those points. Mariela, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think your point about using this as, a way to justify investment is well taken. And that's one of the things that the city of Philadelphia is hoping to do, is actually integrate this into their capital improvements and budgeting process. But yeah, I mean, our whole process, originally we started off with one forecasting model, and we've continued to expand that beyond economics and now to more environmental and health aspects. And so when we work with cities, if we don't have a sort of a built-in forecasting model that they need, we can build one, as long as we believe that there's actually a tie between design and the outcomes that the city wants to influence. And that's exactly what we did for the city of Philadelphia. So, with flood, I think that it would require probably, we only did 17 zip codes, so it would require full spatial analysis, because we didn't get all of the places that were in the floodplain in their case. And what was really interesting was that the flood data really needed to be looked at also with the heat data, because the impact of the built environment was sort of interactive. It influenced both the flood mitigation and the heat mitigation. And when there was a floodplain, the kinds of design features that mattered more were different than when there was not a floodplain. So I'm just kind of answering your question high level, but I mean, it's basically that, you go through that same process of understanding, well, how much of specific outcomes tied to flood mitigation, how much of that is because of improvements to urban design? And we answer that statistically, and that's how we create forecasting models to help cities identify, okay, what do we change and what do we prioritize?
Other questions, especially about data? I mean, I'd love to hear some. Jennifer, you must have a question about the data. I can't hear you.
Sorry, I didn't want any background noise. Yeah, I was just curious, like for the city of Philadelphia, like what kind of data were they able to provide you? A lot of data up front that helped you speed up the timeline to do that, or did you have to collect pretty much all of that data from scratch? I know, you know, like Nashville's done a large tree inventory, but a lot of those other types of data, like curb cuts and stuff, are something that we struggle to maintain.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, most cities don't have an inventory of this kind of micro scale urban design. We collected data on all of that for the city. In this case, they had access to digital imagery that in-house that they had purchased. So that kind of brought down the cost a little bit, because normally we have to essentially source different APIs, like basically pinging imagery to be able to get that, and it costs a little bit of money, not much, but so that brought down their costs and made it a little bit easier. With the other data, data on flood, COVID, all of the demographic data, the city had access to that data already. Some of it we source separately via open sources or census, especially some of the equity data that they hadn't quite considered, that we thought was an important thing to kind of take into account in this relationship. But mostly we always collect the built environment data on our end. That's our crux of our company. That's what we do for cities, in addition to these forecasting models, of course. But the other data, it always helps when cities have access to the data, because then it makes creating the forecasting models, I wouldn't say easier, because it's really difficult, complex modeling. I mean, the relationship between design, people, and then outcomes, you know, as Lucinda's pointed out, like people don't always behave the way you expect them to behave, so you have to account for that a little bit statistically. But it certainly, you know, you overcome one hurdle if the city already has access to the KPIs and performance metrics that we want to say, okay, well, how does this link back to design? And it seems like you guys are already at that step of, okay, we've collected the KPI stuff, we're ready to do the dashboard. Now let's figure out, well, what investments can kind of drive the changes to those KPIs.
And Christine, and then Lucinda, what kind of data are each of you using in your analysis and data sets? Because again, I think it all comes down to what's available and how can you use it?
Yeah, we start with publicly available data to mine, you know, the census, demographic data, socioeconomic data, but we do a fair amount of data collection from the utility, things about their non-payment and water shutoffs, their kind of infrastructure renewal rates in neighborhoods. So we are asking the water utilities to provide us a good amount of data, and typically they have it. It's just, and they sometimes will be collecting it and storing it. They just haven't used it with this lens before. More, it's been done for capital planning or other reports. So we try to keep the data collection as painless as possible, but we do need to, you know, get that data and apply those models.
Lucinda, what about, I know you have a slightly different approach on the data.
Yeah, so the criteria for Neighbourlytics data needs to be accessible hyper-local, so it needs to be accessible at a less than postcode level, like 1 kilometre, 20-minute neighbourhood. It needs to be real-time, it needs to be behavioural, and it needs to be globally accessible, because part of the benefit of digital data is being able to real-time compare cities around the world. And so based on that, we use 3 types of data, and we're constantly adding more. But the first is what we would call places. This is map, you know, open map-based information, so that you might find on Open Maps, Google Maps, community and business pages. The second part is activity data. which might refer to, say, business and community pages that you might find on social media, for example. So we don't use social media in the sense as we don't use sentiment or personal data, but we are looking for the parents club and the soccer group and these other kinds of micro activities that are often invisible to cities. And the third part is interaction data. So then we're looking at check-ins, likes, photos, how people actually rate and review their neighborhood. And we're less interested in the actual comments that they leave, but the fact that one place might have 3,000 reviews and the next place has 6. And so what does that tell us about the relative importance of that? And we can see those kinds of interactions not just for things like businesses and community organizations, but also for parks, public assets, transit. So we're getting a picture of the use of that neighborhood through that activity layer.
So that last piece, Lucinda, I mean, I can see Jeff and Faye's brains working because they're both cultural centers with a lot of visitors. And so it's not just a neighbor, you know, it's not a static neighborhood. It's a, like, you know, Jeff, we've talked around the Orange County has the 2nd largest convention center in the country. And the question is, what's going on around there or over at Universal or Walt Disney? I mean, those could be interesting analysis, right, Jeff?
Yeah, absolutely. I was curious on the, I'm kind of a data nerd as well, so I'm so glad. It's just sometimes I don't get to work on data all the time as I wish I could sometimes, and just focus and head down. But on the, I'm curious, like the ability of data scraping, some of these, of course, publicly accessible databases, as Dr. Boyle mentioned, that ability to do those APIs, and then not just externally, but also the internal data scraping we already have, you know, on ArcGIS, or if we have a variety of different applications that we use. So I'm just curious, like how that data transfer takes place and how we can effectively do that, knowing that there's going to be some gaps, but at least we, especially here at the county level, we actually provide a lot of data and analysis and research to our different municipalities. So we kind of act as that data source as a hub.
Yep. Yeah, so I mean, I'm sure Mariela and Christine probably have answers to this as well. From a Neighbourlytics perspective, the data can be provided in 2 ways. That the really granular data is actually a proprietary data set that we create, so that's accessible through our platform. But the aggregated insights, so say the proportion of particular types of businesses or particular types of activities, can be aggregated and shared, and that is actually commonly how we work with cities. So we've just finished a pilot of working with 20 city governments, and part of that package was that they could have, it's not API, but exported access to data in a format that they could look at in either a geolocated or thematic way. Because one of the things I think we understand is that, you know, the correlations are often what's most powerful. And if you're already working with so many different data sets, often actually what you want is to put that into the infrastructure that you already have rather than adding another. So that means that our expertise becomes more in the analysis and the kind of uniqueness of the data and recommendations, and being able to provide that into what you're already doing.
Any other insights, Christine, on that?
Yeah, you know, since we do work with a lot of municipal governments, we partner with Esri, since Esri is the you know, the mapping software of choice for most municipal governments. So I think using that is a way that we can leverage what you already have in your ArcGIS Online kind of repository, and you know, publish kind of the water equity lens within your you know, within your Esri environment. So that's, but you know, to my founder colleagues here, I think that, you know, these platforms are really great, and that you know, sometimes you need your own to add your magic and user stories to it and use cases. So Esri isn't always the way, but that's what we're doing.
So Janey had an interesting question about publishing indexes that I'll come to in a second. It's something that I'm very, I think a lot about. But Roger or Tom, any questions about, I mean, Tom, we've talked about, you know, the buyouts, and Roger, when you put together, you and Jennifer put together the maps at the beginning where you were showing demographics against floodplains, it was really interesting to hear what Mariela was saying about how, you know, there were other types of data that one could extract that would tell you something more about the community.
And I think at that very beginning point, it was intriguing to us that, one, Tom and I work in the stormwater department of Metro Water Services, and for decades, in Tom's case, this is the only job Tom's ever had. He's been with Metro Water for 35 years. So it's always been associated with the drainage component, the stormwater component, the EPA requirements that you protect water quality. So we're diligent about requiring the water quality treatment for stormwater runoff from new developments, and so it's a key focus of ours. At some point, it became very evident to us that trees were important, and so we launched an initiative to plant many more trees. But the concept that we've heard described here today from all of our incredibly knowledgeable experts is this whole process of using many more factors in a very broad brush kind of a way to capture these components we're very good at, but to use other methods, other means, other components of data about the way we live. Both Orange County and Nashville are big. We're big tourist-oriented cities, and so we're concerned that what drives people to come to our city and to spend their dollars. When we look over our downtown area, there was criticism 10 or 15 years ago about building this big new convention center in an area that was surrounded by little one-story abandoned buildings. Today there's a dozen 20-story hotels that surround that convention center. And so it's interesting to see how the city has reacted and how the development community has reacted to that. Convention center is obviously an attractant. People like to come to Nashville, whether they're interested in country music or just partying. And so there's so many different components of the transition of a city that all collectively working together that have created what this city has become. It's really fascinating, and these different models of working with data from so many different sources is really intriguing to me.
Yeah, I really appreciate your comment, Roger, because I think you totally got this, which was that, and this is why we had Christine, Mariela, and Lucinda talk, was there are a lot of data sets out there. And now what's happening is we're getting the science and the technology and the analytics that we can correlate them. I mean, correlation can be dangerous, and we all know that, but at the same time, it can also be valuable. And that was the whole purpose of this, was to show that instead of, producing 1,000 pages of paper that, has a set date on it, why aren't cities using platforms and technology that allow them to do real-time analysis of multiple data sets? I'm sure Faye or Jeff, do you have something to add to that? Because I mean, I know, having talked to both of you, that this would be something that, would be very valuable to how you're trying to solve problems.
I'd like one of the things I've been thinking about as we've been going through this is that, and it's been very instructive to hear the presenters today in terms of talking about that. I reflected back to the project that we're talking to you about right now, of how do we really think about infrastructure in a very broad way, and how do we talk about how that very broad definition of infrastructure makes for really successful, healthy, prosperous, resilient communities. And how do all of these data drivers that we've heard from today enable us to be far more nimble about that? We oftentimes think about that comprehensive look at things as being a part of comp plans that communities do. They're static, they're paper, they sit on the shelf then and they get updated and that's not at all what a vibrant, living, breathing, happening city needs right now. And it's very much the kind of tools we've talked about today. And it's also that intersection of a far broader definition of infrastructure and infrastructure systems. Because if you don't have, you may have a great transportation system, but if you don't also have good healthcare infrastructure and good communication, or you may have your sustainability infrastructure, but if you also don't have social services and transportation and housing, if you're not addressing food security, there's all those pieces that really have to come together, and the kind of insights we can get from a much more innovative way to think about data analysis that we've heard described today is absolutely key to all of that.
No, thanks, Faye. And again, it was your equity by design piece that got me started on all this. Tom, you had a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, for us, we've been very successful in the home buyout. We've purchased 400 homes to date, and I just put a list together of another 800 that we could do. So we still have a lot of low-hanging fruit, I like to call it. But the thing that we're missing is, sometimes when I get the opportunity, I lose that homeowner. I lose that sale for reasons that I don't fully understand. So what I want through all this is, what could I do better, and what pieces am I missing? So when we approach these homeowners, again, we do think and feel, here's an engineer saying how he feels, but we do feel that when we take these properties down and create open space and reestablish stream buffers, we know that there's benefits, and there's a lot of benefits that we can't put a price tag on it, but maybe through some of this, we can put a price tag on it. But again, for me, is I don't get very many opportunities to go into a neighborhood and make a real change by taking a house down that will never flood again. So I'd like some of this information that you all propose today to help me be more successful than we've been so far. So
yeah, the whole idea, we've talked about this, Tom, in the other Nashville sessions, is coming up with what makes that community. And sometimes it's the home, sometimes it's not. As Lucinda pointed out, it was in one community just an asphalt basketball court as opposed to some, multi-million-dollar thing. And we often, we think we're well-intentioned and spend the money, but it's not directed at an outcome that will actually improve the community. So we've been going on for about 80 minutes now, and I knew this would happen because this is a good group, but are there any other questions, especially for Mariela, Christine, or Lucinda? I think what they're doing is just unbelievably innovative and interesting. And and I just want to compliment them, but I also want to compliment you guys with Nashville. We've been working with you and Jeff from Orange County for just being so interested in changing the outcomes for your communities. But any last questions before we hang up? Janey, I knew. Go ahead. You had a big smile, so I knew you'd have a question.
I always have questions. Getting to what Tom's talking about, is there potential to use some of these tools to assess an area of a community and say, here are the characteristics that make this desirable? And say, okay, we're targeting 3 homes in this area for buyout. What other areas in the broader Nashville have similar characteristics that would be a place to help those individuals being bought out relocate to and feel like they're have their comfort zone and have that a similar level of sense of community or access to amenities, that sense of place, or the similar destinations? Do you all see that as a potential application of this to help Tom go to homeowners for the buyout and say, we're going to buy you out, and here are other areas of the city that would offer that warm fuzzy feeling you have here? Because I think the connection to home and community is part of the reason people turn down the buyouts. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And briefly, I know we're short on time.
That's such an interesting use case that I had never considered, but that's why I love these kinds of conversations. But I mean, yes, from the simple answer, you can measure built environment characteristics, and because we break this down into 10 aspects of urban design, you can get really fine grained, like, oh no, this area has a lot of parks and public spaces and very good on traffic safety, for example, and that's really what drives people's attachment to it from a built environment perspective. But I think that to do what you're asking, you would absolutely have to integrate Lucinda's data, because we can't measure the exactly how that person is using that space and why they chose those particular built environment features.
I just want to share a very quick example of we experimented with a similar question last year, in that we took our whole database across and we looked at just Australian geographies, but we looked at 2,000 neighbourhoods, and we asked the computer model to cluster it by similar places. And it gave us results that we weren't expecting, because places that have similar levels of cafes and community activity may actually be manifest in different kinds of built environments. And that was a surprise to us how it was clustered. Now, that was a very preliminary model that needs a lot of verification and needs much more urban design analysis as well. But it was curious to us that it actually found similarities in, like, what was considered similar in terms of its urban life was not always physically similar. And some physically similar places were quite different in the urban life.
Yeah, one of the things that, you know, just as an aside, one of the things we've learned in the work with Nashville is the prevalence of these low-cost sensors. You remember, Tom and Roger, Jennifer, when we learned from Charlotte and Carrie about there were new use cases because you were collecting new types of data. And all of a sudden, you know, you had use cases that you never knew about, like, you know, affluent outflows and stuff like that, emergencies. And I think that's exactly what you were talking about, Janey, is that the more data we collect, it's just a matter of experimentation and iteration, really. Instead of coming at this with, like some communities I know, which is, you know, I want to answer these 3 questions and I'm going to get all the data to answer those questions. You actually let the data lead you, and you let it iterate to the point where you come up with new use cases and new answers. And that's what's so fascinating about this approach. That you know, multi-billion-dollar company like Xylem, a startup like State of Place, and then, you know, Neighbourlytics is a very successful company in Australia. And it's just amazing that these things are now available. So with that, I know Janey's kids came home. I know the rest of us are ready to.
I've got to drop mine off now.
Yeah, exactly. I can't thank you guys enough for this discussion. I think it's really been fascinating. And for any of the audience, I know Xylem is looking to work with cities. I know State of Place. I know Neighbourlytics is now going to start looking to work with cities in the US. And please feel free to contact me at the council and I'll introduce you to them. And of course, we're continuing our work with Nashville and with Orange County. And with that, I hope everybody has a nice evening and a nice morning. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you.